All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something that I think trips up a lot of people, and that's where you document staging requirements within a project.
Yeah,
So, where do those specifics go?
yeah, yeah. It's a really important point, right?
Hmm.
Because if you don't get that right, then everything else can kind of fall apart.
Absolutely. You've shared some material with me. We're going to dig into that and see if we can, you know, get some clarity. This deep dive specifically is going to be based on the book Project Management for Project Managers by Orlando Casabone.
Great book.
So when we talk about where staging requirements live, there are a few options that people usually throw out there, right?
Yeah.
We've got your product backlog, maybe a separate staging document. Some folks think it should be in the release plan or even the project plan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All seem plausible at first glance.
right. So let's start with the product backlog. It's often described as this, central hub for everything related to the product.
Yeah.
So what makes it a good fit for staging requirements in your mind?
Well, I think the key here is how the product backlog kind of evolves. I mean, kept like every single aspect of that product's life cycle, you know?
Right.
So thinking about it that way, staging of requirements, they're not really this isolated thing.
Yeah.
They're really just another piece of the puzzle.
Right. They are part of the whole, how do we get this product ready? I mean, the entire life cycle. And they just happen to be specific to making sure it's ready for a specific environment, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So if the product backlog is sort of like our central hub, like you were saying, then maybe a separate staging document starts to feel, I don't know, a little bit out of place.
Yeah.
What's the potential downside of keeping staging information sort of siloed like that?
Well, the biggest risk is that you lose that connection. You
Mm.
know, the staging they need to be right there alongside the core features in the product backlog.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, how do you know you're prioritizing things correctly?
Right. I'm thinking if they're not right there together, you might not see those dependencies, right? You might miss something crucial and then you get to release time
That's a fire drill.
and it's a total fire
Yeah,
drill.
exactly. So much harder to keep everything aligned if you've got separate documents floating around.
Yeah. Okay, so staging document, maybe not the best approach. What about the release plan? I mean, that outlines when the features are going to be delivered. So couldn't you just tie the staging requirements directly to that timeline?
I mean, staging is definitely super important for any release. But the release plan is really more about the when, right?
Oh.
It says, hey, feature X is going live in sprint Y. But it doesn't usually get into the nuts and bolts of how you configure that feature in the staging environment or what tests need to be run.
Mm-hmm.
You need somewhere to capture all those specifics.
Yeah, and then that feels like that belongs more with the features themselves, right? Like alongside them in the product backlog.
Absolutely. That's where you get into the really granular level detail of the requirements.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about the product backlog, a separate staging document, the release plan. There's one more option that some folks think might be the right place, and that's the project plan,
Right.
which gives you that big picture overview of how the whole project's going to be executed. Where do you think staging activities kind of slot into that overall plan, and why isn't the project plan the best place for all those details?
So you're definitely going to see staging activities outlined in the project plan,
Yeah.
in terms of timelines and maybe resource allocation.
Mm,
But the project plan is intentionally very high level.
right.
It's not going to get into the weeds of specific configurations or testing steps for staging.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, that level of detail can change as the project goes on.
Right.
So it makes more sense to keep it with the features in a more dynamic
Yeah.
document.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, so the product backlog really seems to be winning out here. But I want to dig into why that is. About this idea of it being a living document, I think that's really key.
Yeah.
So if staging requirements are part of the product backlog, they can evolve along with the product features themselves.
Precisely. If you introduce a new feature and it's got some unique staging needs, you capture all of that together.
Right.
And then everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
Developers, product owners, stakeholders, they're all looking at the same information.
Right. It's like a single source of truth.
Right. And that just makes everything smoother. Clearer communication, better prioritization, and ultimately a much less stressful deployment.
And that's what we all want, right?
Exactly.
Less stress.
Yeah.
All right, so it really does seem like, based on all this, that the product backlog is the place to be when you're talking about staging requirements, especially when you're scaling a Scrum project.
Agreed. It's the most logical and effective way to make sure everything stays connected,
Yeah.
and those critical staging considerations are part of the conversation from day one.
And if folks want to learn more about this and other project management best practices, we always recommend Project Management for Project Managers by Orlando Caspa.
Great resource.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up another deep dive. Hopefully, this has given you some food for thought, listeners. As you're working on your own projects, think about how keeping those staging requirements within your product backlog could streamline your processes and keep everyone aligned. Until next time, keep diving deep.